But I think Bill has said everything about him, just about, we could say, just written countless articles and decades of finishing experience. Michael's talked to us early. He was one of our early presenters in the Guild, and everybody really enjoyed hearing from him then too. So I think he's going to do a little demonstration tonight if I had it right. So go ahead, Michael.
Are we ready to start?
We're ready.
Good evening. To start. My name is Michael Dresdner, and we're going to talk about finishing tonight. Some of you sent questions earlier, so I've printed them out so I could get through them as quickly as I could. So let's just dive in. I organized them by groups. So the first one is it better to sand by hand or by machine? Well, if you don't own a sanding machine, then definitely it's better to sand by hand. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I will tell you that the wood does not know whether you sanded it by hand or by machine. And in fact, we don't ever sand, or almost never ever sand with the grain anyway. So even if I'm sanding by hand, I'm going to start by sanding diagonally to the board. Then when I change grits, I'll go diagonally the other way. That way, when I change, once all the diagonals from one sanding are gone, I know it's time to stop. With a machine, you don't have that advantage. So you have to do something a little bit different if you sand by machine. And it's pretty simple. Most machines, if you actually read the instructions with them, and I'm not suggesting you do, that's un-American, but if you actually read them, here's what they would say. They would say that you should not press down on the sander because that can slow it down, and that you should move it about 1 inch per second. So if you can, take a piece of regular 8.5 by 11 paper here and put your finger on one end and move it across so that it takes you 11 seconds to get from one end to the next. That is how fast you should be moving your sander, and almost nobody does. But here's the thing. If you move the sander that slowly, then you only need to cover the area once, and it will get rid of all of the sanding scratches from the last sanding. And that's really all you are trying to do with each successive sanding. Does that make sense? So is there any particular advantage to sanding by hand? Nothing that I can think of. On some unusual pieces, you might want to sand in a particular direction, but by and large, it just doesn't matter. So if you've got a sander, use it. Can I scrape instead of sanding? And if not, why not? The answer to that is probably not. Here's why. If you were to look at a scraped piece of wood and a sanded piece of wood under a microscope, you would see clearly that there's a very big difference. Scraped wood tends to be cleanly cut and might be slightly burnished, whereas sanded wood is actually shredded. The problem is that the way stain and finish addresses those two surfaces are very different. So if you took a scraped piece and sanded piece of the same wood side by side and stained them with the same stain, they would come out different. For that reason, you have to either do one or the other. Well, right away, there's a problem here. If you're making a box with all flat sides and sharp corners, you could theoretically scrape the whole thing. But if you're making a table with turned legs and flutes and other things, there is no way you're going to be able to scrape the entire thing. The rule is, if you can't scrape it all, then you sand it all, because you want the surface to be the same all over, and that way the stain and the finish will be addressed the same way all over. Does that make sense? Okay, next. This is the same question. Must I sand plywood before finishing, and why? The answer is yes, in most cases. Why? The same reason as before. Plywood is typically not sanded. The veneer comes off a press knife, so it's somewhat crushed and smooth, and it's pressed on. So if any part of that piece, even just the edges that you're breaking by hand, if any part of it's going to be sanded, you got to sand the whole thing. They speak of that surface as mill glaze, but in fact, all it is something that's not as shredded as a sanded surface. So you want that uniformity. So yes, in most cases, you're going to have to sand plywood. Unless you made a box completely of plywood and you've never touched any of it with any sandpaper, then you're good to go. Okay, how does one choose the type of sandpaper to use? Well, I mean, this is much too broad a question for tonight, but I'll just touch on a couple things. First, if you're sanding raw wood, the best grit to use is aluminum oxide, and most of the raw wood sandpaper is aluminum oxide. Equally good, but different, is garnet. If you sand with garnet, when you get done sanding, you'll have soft U-shaped scratches. If you sand with aluminum oxide, when you get done sanding, you'll have sharper V-shaped scratches. These two modalities will accept stain differently. So end up with either one or the other. I used to sand with aluminum oxide, and then at the very end, I would sand with garnet by hand just to smooth it off and make it take stain more evenly. But there's no problem sticking with aluminum oxide all the way through. When you start sanding finish, in most cases, especially if it's a very hard finish like polyester, you're going to want to switch to silicon carbide. While aluminum oxide is friable, friable means that the little grits, as you sand with them, fracture. And when they fracture, they present a new sharp point. So it stays sharp until you're all the way done with your sanding with that paper. Silicon carbide doesn't fracture as easily. It can, but it generally doesn't. And because a really tough finish will cause aluminum oxide to fracture too quickly, in most cases, we use silicon carbide for that. There is an exception. The aluminum oxide we use these days is all synthesized, it's manufactured, and they can make it harder or less hard, more friable or less friable. So there are always exceptions. Other than that, the type of sandpaper you use depends on what you like to use. Some people like a thinner backing, some like a thicker backing. For the most part, everything that we sand with is open coat rather than closed coat. Closed coat means all of the little grits are one right up against the other. Open coat means there's spaces in between them. The spaces in between them act like the spaces on your table saw blade. It's to clear swarf, and that's what it does, and it helps it not clog. There's also interlaced paper. So paper that self-lubricating, that's the term they use. There are now papers that are not papers. There are sanding media that are on open web discs. In other words, mesh that looks like a screen mesh that has grit in it. So all of that is whatever works best for you and whatever you like best. Once again, the wood doesn't know what you're using or how you're doing it. So that's really what do I like using, what works for me. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, they tested types of sandpaper, and they used robots, meaning they took out the human element, and they're all name brands, and they're mostly 5-inch discs. I watched the whole program. It's quite impressive, but it was kind of like laboratory testing, and they harnessed the robotics from other companies, and they got sponsors, and they did a big analysis where they actually measured the grams of removal after a certain number of minutes, and it was very scientific. And he's a YouTube guy who's very popular. Many of you maybe watched him. He sells various products and stuff.
Okay, let me stop you right there. It sounds to me like what they did is a product shootout. We do those all the time in the magazines. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say it was.
I'm going to tell you right now
yes.
that with rare exceptions, I do not talk about product names. I leave that up to you. And I try and keep everything generic. I don't want to get into that. And the main reason is that I've been involved in a lot of these tests for the magazines that I've written for. And there are times when you can finish your test and 2 months later, the company changes what it's doing and it becomes meaningless again. So you're going to have to rely on yourself when it comes to choosing what is the best brand. Number two, what is best for you may not be best for the robot because you're not a robot. You see what I'm saying here? These tests sound really cool, but in practical terms, they rarely offer very much help. Now, yes, there are better brands and worse brands, and you're going to find that out either talking to your friends or better yet, just using them yourself. You'll find the ones that you like best. I've had people get into these arguments all online that say, I've been using 316U and it is the best. And the next guy will say, that stuff's awful. I use it. So I don't really even want to dabble in that type of brand name shootout. There's just too many things that may not work for you. This is about you. You choosing what works best for you.
Thank you.
All right, let's get away from sanding. Move on. Coloring. How do I create a jet black piano finish on a new big leaf maple cabinet? First of all, there's a jet black finish and there's a piano finish, and they're not the same thing. So I'm going to explain both of them to you. When you're working with a wood like maple, you're going to find that if you put dye or pigment on it, you're going to have a really, really hard time getting it pure black. So what do you want to use instead? This is what you want to use instead. This is India ink, and it is pretty much the only thing that'll make something as dense as maple black. So that's what you would do. You would use that as a black finish. Well, what about piano finish? What are they? They're a little bit different. The reason is that piano finishes are built up very, very thick, 12 coats or more. The problem there is that if you put down a black pigment, which is what this is, and then you build up 12 coats of clear, it's not going to be black anymore. It's going to start getting hazy. So on a piano finish, what we typically do is we do stain the wood. And then after that, each coat of clear that we add, we put just a little bit of black dye. No matter how much you build it up, it's still black. But because it's just a small amount of dye, and dye is somewhat translucent, it gives you the ability to look down into the finish all the way to the bottom. And it gives this incredible depth. And that is what is known as a piano finish. So you have two different things. In either case, I would do your original staining with India ink. But if you're going to do a piano finish, make sure you add a little bit of black dye to each coat of the clear so you don't lose your black, but you still maintain that depth and clarity. Is that, whoever asked that, does that answer your question?
Yes.
I'm going to break my rule tonight, and I'll explain why I'm doing it when I get to that, but I will break my rule. Which dyes can be added to which finishes? Okay, this goes back to solvencies, all right? So originally, we used to make dyes in 3 formats: oil soluble, water soluble, and alcohol soluble. Now there's a new iteration, and there is something called, well, the company that makes it calls it ergospurs. But what it is the dye that's been ground into a wide spectrum solvent. In this case, it's a glycol ether. So the glycol ether dye concentrate, it's a liquid dye concentrate, and you can add it directly to shellac, lacquer, water-based coatings, pretty much anything except oil. If you're adding dye to oil, you still need to use oil-soluble dyes. So what can be added? Whatever the solvency is for the dye has to match the solvency of the finish. Is that okay? Does that answer your question? Yes? No?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything else? Or I mean, that's what you wanted to know, which dyes can be added to which finishes. If you want to know which dyes I personally like best, they're these.
That's it.
Called Transtent. And Transtent is a third generation dye. The first generation dyes were coal tar dyes, some often called aniline dyes, because aniline was one of the intermediaries in processing the dye. Then we're up to third generation now, and the difference is that these third generation dyes are much more light fast. Dyes used to be very, very fugitive. These are very light fast. This is a very intense concentration, so you can add a drop or two at a time, and it's ground in a glycol ether, which means it's compatible with shellac, lacquer, and water-based coatings. So it's a wide compatibility and a very, very strong concentration. You can also just mix it with water and use it as a standard water dye. And because it's been concentrated, you can mix it as strong or as weak as you want. So it gives you a lot of control. And I think when it comes to coloring wood, control is the main thing. So that's the one I particularly prefer. This is actually made by a very large company and repackaged by a very, very small company, because the company who makes what's in here did not sell it to you. So this guy stepped up. His name's Jeff Jewett, an old friend of mine, and he said, I'm going to repackage this stuff and sell it in small enough containers so that woodworkers can use it. It's something that we've had in the industry for a long time. Formulators had it, but he made it available to everyone. And it's really nice stuff. If you have not played around with that, I would suggest trying some. You can get it at almost anywhere. Rockler, Woodcraft, everybody sells that. Or you can get it direct from him at homesteadfinishing.com. Okay? So which dyes can be added to which finishes? By the way, if you add dyes to water-based finishes, it can go one of two ways. See, water-based finishes actually have two phases. They have a resin phase and a water phase. So if you add water-soluble dye, it goes into the water phase. But if you add a dye that's compatible with the resin, it goes into the resin phase. What's the difference? When the water-based finish dries, it forms little balls of finish that stick together like brickwork. If your dye was in the water phase, the dye is going to be winding through those little bricks. In other words, it's going to be in the mortar. If you put a dye that goes directly into the resin phase, it's more uniform. Okay, does that make sense? All of this is true for simple finishes. When we get into very complex finishes, where they're curing and chemical reactive finishes, it gets more complicated because you have to look at the chemical reactions and make sure they don't make the dye go sour. Good example, if you use a basic dye in an acid cured finish, and there are a bunch of acid cured finishes out there. We call them conversion varnishes. Some people call them catalyzed lacquer. That's a misnomer, but you can sometimes get a reaction where the dye is disabled by the activator in the finish. So when you get into high-tech finishes, it gets more complicated. But we're not going to go there tonight. If you need information on that, just contact me directly. All right, we ready to move on? Let's go to the real meat of the program. Core filling. Were there any other questions on coloring? It's a huge field. I recently did a 3-hour program for another guild just on coloring wood. And let me tell you, it's a huge field.